Massachusetts. Shaleen has actually written the cannabis legalization law of Massachusetts. So, over to you, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you to Operation Black Vote, Blaksox, Transform, Stopwatch. Thank you, Katrina, and all of you for coming. Earlier, we were reading the bios, and it said in Viv's bio that he's a futurist. And we asked him, what's a futurist? And he said, it's about thinking 7 generations ahead. And that really highlights the opportunity that we have, the people in this room and the people working on this issue, because it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that something like this gets created, and we get to decide how much of an influence we will have on it. And it will absolutely make an impact 7 generations into the future and further. And I feel a little bit of nostalgia being here, because it was like 6 years ago now, I guess, that we were at this spot in Massachusetts. And we were watching that previously states had legalized cannabis. And I worked on those campaigns. It wasn't intentional. I mean, it never is intentional. But they had not, as they should have, centered the communities, we all know who the communities are, that were harmed, that should be benefited by legal regulation. And so in Massachusetts, we got in rooms like this, and we essentially said we're going to create a coalition that is going to make the demand that legalization will not move forward in Massachusetts unless it makes that change. And back then, it was a little more of a risky thing to talk about, I guess the same place where it is here. But we didn't have the opportunity for very powerful people to already understand how important this was. So we had to go and tell them, marijuana legalization is coming, there's a $1 billion industry coming, somebody is going to make this money, and we should make sure that it's fair. And we created that coalition. And I will tell you, 6 years later, even though I'm a commissioner and I'm supposed to have this power, we still need to get that coalition together all the time, because they're always, and when I say they, I mean that just in a large sense, they're always trying to thwart that progress. And we always have to get that coalition back together. So start making that today. I mean that figuratively, but I also mean that literally. Sign up for these organizations, meet each other, share information, because you have such an opportunity to make an influence that we don't have anywhere else. And take a moment to savor it, too, because you don't realize that you're a part of history at the time. You look back later and you realize that was history making. So let me briefly recap how I got here. So the Cannabis Control Commission is the agency in Massachusetts that is in charge of implementing legal marijuana. So we make all of the decisions about regulation, we license businesses, we register patients. It's about 60 people, and it's led by 5 commissioners. And under the law, because we demanded it, there are 5 different expertise areas that we represent, which are public health, public safety, business, regulation, and my seat, which is social justice. So every time we make a decision, we come from those 5 angles, and if social justice isn't adequately represented, then we change it until it is. Because under Massachusetts law, as the people demanded, that is part of our goal, that the affected communities have to be included in the industry and positively impacted. I did an interview with The Guardian earlier this week, and I explained some of our programs, and they really liked then they made it a headline, the idea that I didn't use the word drug dealers, I used the word underground operators, but they made the headline, the UK is being advised by the Massachusetts Commissioner to include and recruit drug dealers into the legal marijuana industry, which is true, but it's actually much bigger than that. You look at a report like this, and it doesn't matter if you're in the drug trade or not, if you're part of an over-policed community, and I don't need to tell you this, you have been affected in a way where if we're going to have responsible regulation of Cannabis, it's not just about labeling and packaging and testing, it's about acknowledging that the government messed up, targeted certain communities, and it's on us to acknowledge and address that. And I know that sitting here before legalization, that may sound so far ahead, and you might be thinking, you know, I don't even know how I feel about legalization yet, let alone all of this. But that's the whole point. You have to be ready, if you care about this, to be at the center of the conversation now, to frame this from the beginning. And if you're willing, if you're able to stand up and say, I'm part of this community, here's the data, and legalization won't move forward unless it's fair, unless it's just. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we've interpreted that in Massachusetts. We started with a report actually just like this, and we identified what communities disproportionately harmed means. So if you look at the report that our agency has put out, we went by race. Sometimes you hear it's communities of color that have been affected, but I actually strongly encourage us in this context to not use that term because it lumps all the groups together, when in fact, if you look at Massachusetts, it's Black and Latino people specifically. If you look at Asians, for example, Asians are actually more like whites, where they're arrested at a lower rate. So specifically Black and Latino people and people from geographically identified areas with higher rates of arrest and incarceration, people with drug convictions, and parents and spouses of people with drug convictions are all part of this program that we call the Equity Program. And a primary basis is when this event was introduced, they talked about how it's access to information. That's the purpose of events like this. It's kind of the same with the Equity Program. It's about making that information that is so often invisible or inaccessible, or, you know, even though you're the most targeted community, you're the last one to get that information. It's about addressing that. So those groups that I mentioned are part of the Equity Program, where you get technical assistance, you get exclusive access to certain types of licenses, and you get fee waivers, and you get other benefits until we meet this goal of including disproportionately harmed communities in the industry, and we will keep measuring it because it's not about the right talking points and the right words. It's about the actual number and the economics. So I really want to encourage you to take over the narrative. And if you're used to being cynical, if you have a totally justified distrust of the political process and the government, which I understand and I had as well, I'll just tell you from experience that there's something really special about cannabis regulation, where it's very disorienting to the existing elites, corporate establishment, the general machine, because there's no playbook. And because everywhere that has legalized cannabis, it's been done truly by the people, not by politicians. Politicians have been dragged along for the ride, and they don't even really understand what's going on. And I've been in a lot of these different places and seen it happen. Take advantage of that disorientation and take advantage of that vacuum, because there will be a point where it's clear that legalization is going to happen, and people will be looking around at each other like, what's going on here? What's the example? Looking for information. And if you're ready at that time, and you've formed your coalition, and you've done your research, and you've been thoughtful, and you step up right then, you will be the first person there to frame the issue and to have the biggest impact that you can. And I'm so willing to help. Like, that's the whole reason that I'm here. It's my job description to ensure that there's social justice and legalization in Massachusetts, and I think it's as important everywhere else. So I offer all the information that I can to all of these organizations. And also, you can quote me. You can say, the Massachusetts commissioner came and said, because of the statistics in Massachusetts, we acknowledge we messed up and it's on us to fix it, and here's the same statistics, so why aren't you saying the same thing? You should ask that in public. I would encourage you to. Are there people here that have concerns about whether legalization is the right thing to do in terms of the risks of cannabis? Do you want me to address that at all? Okay. Let me quickly share an anecdote that I think helps to address that. So I mentioned there's 5 commissioners in our agency, and I had worked on legalization. The woman in the public health seat had been very anti-legalization. And so when we started our discussions, which are all public, people expected that she and I would be the ones most in disagreement. But what actually ended up happening is, if you ask her, she would say, since we legalized anyway, let's at least do regulation, right? If you ask me, I'll say the whole point of legalization is to regulate the product, right? Either way, what we found is that when we have our meetings now and we are making marketing restrictions, we're making sure that youth don't have access to this product, that if you're under 21, you can't get into a store, when companies are misbehaving and they're getting fined, it's actually the two of us that tend to lead and be the most in agreement. So I would really encourage you to try and move away from the idea of pro-legalization versus anti-legalization, or pro-cannabis versus anti-cannabis, and look instead at the states that have legalized and think about how they've regulated, because that's really what will determine the impacts of the policy. And there's a lot of other organizations, particularly Transform, that make that case really well, but I just tell you that as an anecdote from personal experience. And then I also know that I'm not naive to think that this is easy. I know that there are a lot of obstacles in place. There are a lot of, I think Jane said they're rubbing their hands together and waiting. But imagine also that when you have an impact at the very beginning like this, with this tiny industry that will start and now grow and grow, and this is what I tell myself when it gets hard, if you make just a 5% shift in the right direction, imagine the impact that it will have as it grows across the country over future years. This tiny change that you've made, this one word that you got in, this one program, it's going to multiply and multiply. And so I want to end with something. Jane mentioned earlier how in New York the bill hasn't passed, and most of us observers would say it's because it didn't have enough in terms of social justice. So the question there is, who is against equity? Because if you look at what happened in New York, there was nobody standing up and saying, no, I don't want to have social justice and equity in this bill. But what you see instead is, and this will sound familiar, I think, to all people of color, what you have instead is this group that will use all the right talking points because they sound good. They're very effective in polling. They'll talk about racial justice. They'll talk about making a positive impact on communities. And they will use the blood and sweat and tears of They will use the blood and sweat and tears to try and get legalization passed. But then they'll say, well, let's just hold off on the equity pieces of it, right? Let's not put any teeth on that part of the law. Let's make sure that that happens later, and we absolutely will, and we need your endorsement now, and we need you at the press conference now, and we need you to send this email to your email list. And we'll worry about that later, but right now, let's let the grown-ups be in charge. You know, the people with the banking relationships, the people with the big companies, the people with the resources, the people that can get this industry on the ground more efficiently. Let's let them be in charge, and we'll worry about social justice later. From experience, has that worked in the past? No. So what I would encourage you to do is form a really strong coalition, and don't be afraid to walk away from the table like people in New York and other states have, because you have so much power and you will never have this much power again, and I really encourage you to use it.
Thank you, Shaleen. I'm sure that's provoked some questions. Hey, go on.
For me, I was done for possession when I was younger, but I just want to know what success would look like to you, because me myself, I've invested in certain cannabis companies that are big and been going for a few years now, and they're, as you said, about 7 generations in the future. They're probably looking at it like that anyway. So I want to know what success would look like in, say, Massachusetts, and sort of feed it back into what we'd see here.
So ideally, we would repair all of the harm that was caused, but I don't think that's possible. I think it's possible to repair the harm. So we just want to at least try and make an effort. The school to prison pipeline is a very real thing. I would love to see the opposite. I would love to see that. I mean, I tend to focus on business because we're a business licensing agency, so jobs and ownership and information is what I can control. But bigger than that, I would love to see a reinvestment into those same communities, whether you call it equity or social justice or reparations or whatever you use. Whatever word you use, the concept is that we take that harm that was caused and we take the benefits that come from legalization and we put them in the same place. That's what it looks like to me. Did that answer the question?
It does, but I'm saying, how do we get to control that? Because I know, say, the companies I've invested in, most of our people are not investing that. So they're not going to, unless it's given to them, they're not going to actually reap that benefit. So I'm talking about reaping it for yourself. So,
I mean, for me, we take very clear statistics. So to get into the program, I mentioned those specific qualifications. We track that, and we track the women, the people of color, the veterans, the people with disabilities who are in the industry at different levels. And then we just watch our programs and we see if it makes an impact. So I have a real quantitative view of that.
Yeah, I'm really interested in finding out about the business opportunities as well. But on the other side, I've had the unfortunate experience of having a nephew who, is in Broadmoor for murder. As a result, not necessarily directly as a result, but he's been involved in cannabis and having an effect on him as well. My godson, I was at the Old Bailey today, again, was charged with 5 attempted murder of another North Londoner stabber, who stabbed 5 people. Again, cannabis is a boy. So that's so although I'm looking for opportunities for the community, for business, like you're saying, I'm very willing to do so. We just want to have, in terms of a balance, in terms of the negative effects of cannabis, and how can it be? Is it, in your experience, has it been avoided by maybe legalising it? Has it been, as impurities been taken out or whatever?
Yeah. Let me first just echo what Sir Woolley said earlier, which is that legalization of cannabis alone will not fix these problems. We're being ridiculous if we think so. But what it does do is it stops one type of arrest, which is very, very popular, and it takes away a tool that law enforcement use, that pretext of, say, the smell of cannabis. Those things are really important. So in terms of the benefits of legalization, the data that we have, which is admittedly limited, shows that youth use across the U.S. has not gone up. In fact, in legalized states, it has gone down. But the perception of risk is a concern because fewer young people see marijuana as harmful. But that hasn't translated into increased use. So we need to keep watching that. We need to make sure that public health initiatives like public education campaigns, public awareness campaigns are all a strong part of legalization. And we also have a very strong testing program where nothing can be sold unless it's been tested for pesticides, which are banned, heavy metals, contaminants, and the potency, which is clearly labeled on the package.
A question to you. Do you want to pass the mic?
Yeah, that's actually a very good comment, and let me just say that I was sectioned in 2015, and cannabis formed a part of that, but that's not the question that I want to focus on. I think one of the obstacles for legislation changing in the UK is the structure. And do you think then in the US on a federal level it would actually be legalized?
Yes, I think it's imminent, but I am very concerned about the way that it's done, the way it's going to be done. That's the real question, because we now have 11 different states with mostly different referendums that did it different ways, and the companies are lobbying for federal legalization to just go incrementally and address something like banking without addressing all of the reinvestment, and if that happens, that's probably going to do more harm than good. So you will see people opposing that, and it may put off federal legalization for a while, but like I said, sometimes you have to walk away from the table.
Good question, Sunny. Okay.
Hi. I've got a question. I want cannabis to be free, but I'm suspicious, having been in the industry and watched it for the last few years, the perception or the interpretation of what legalization actually means. When I'm seeing a lot of the industrial hemp companies in Canada being bought out by companies which are listed on the stock market. And for me, the key word here is sovereignty. And I remember in Colorado 2 years ago, there was a group of cannabis companies obviously selling the full plant. They couldn't get loans from the banks, so they decided to set up their own cooperative bank. And the license was blocked because with a cooperative, everyone in this room owns the co-op, then we've got complete sovereignty over it. It's not something that's needing to be or wanting to be listed on the stock exchange. And when it's on the stock exchange, that's something that is then going to be at the behest of Bayer or Monsanto, all these big companies. So, but within that, the word legalization is not so much about whether council tax is legal or cannabis. My question, I just want to play devil's advocate here, is the law itself that governs every aspect of our society, is that law itself even legal or not? I'm just throwing it out there because I feel that cannabis itself is not even being made illegal. But when it gets legalized, is it then going to be pushed from the size of this room to a little corner, which is then going to be something that's going to be controlled by Pfizer and all these big drug companies? But I just, I'm throw a spanner in the works here, but I just feel that what does the word legal actually mean? Is cannabis even legal itself? And I just want to throw that out there and see what people think of that. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't have a direct answer to that. I'll open it up to my panelists, but I do want to highlight two very important things. And one is, I wrote, when I go and address other states about what their legalization law should look like, each time I rewrite it because I learn new things every day. And I recently published those top 10 things. You can find them online. But the number one was home grow, the right to home grow, because I think you can't call something legalization if you don't include the right for a person to just grow a personal amount at home. The second thing is we have very strict ownership and control limits in Massachusetts. You can't own more than 3 of each license type. And the reason is that the voters were very clear in the referendum that they don't want this to be an industry that's dominated by a few big corporations. And I share that because you can do whatever you want with your law in the UK. It doesn't have to look like every other one, and you can certainly address all of the points that you just made in the law.
Over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. One question I have is just around how do we ensure, or let me start again. So in terms of social justice, for example, how do we ensure that doesn't get lost within a broader corporate social responsibility kind of movement, which a lot of the bigger companies will obviously be will legally have to do. And secondly, I'm an advocate of lived experience, and that lived experience could be, criminal justice, could be, race disparity, could be lots of different things. And particularly around how people activate their experiences to then go back into the communities or try and tackle that social harm. I've come from the background of the addiction field, and quite often people with lived experience would tokenistically be used to either be consulted with or to sit on kind of various panels or strategy boards. So the follow-up, the second part of the question is just around what type of opportunities are being offered to people who have been affected by kind of drug policy in the States. And my dream is that for people that have been affected by inequalities, that they can rise to positions of power, because I think that will bring a great deal of good. So that's the two parts. So CSR and around, how do we avoid tokenism?
I love these questions. I can tell just for how informed the questions are, like you guys have got this. I really appreciate that question. And I'm so ready to answer it because I've been absolutely thinking about it. So the way that you avoid these requirements from becoming just generic social responsibility nonsense is by making sure that you have a person with lived experience who is making the day-to-day regulatory decisions. And I would advocate, and this is in my list as well, that someone with lived experiences should be included on the board of something like our commission, because you cannot predict the twists and turns it'll take. And the language that we wrote that said disproportionately harmed communities have to be included, that could have been interpreted as like some dumb bulletin board somewhere, and then they could have said, check, we're done. So if you don't have a person that's representing those interests every day, they won't go all the way. And you can absolutely mandate that, and I think you should.
Brilliant. There was one more question at the back. Yeah. If we do a final question from you, and then we'll move.
Can I ask after?
We'll have another question at the end.
You want the
I'm going to be very strict.
It was just under, is it to advocate the use of cannabis to be legalized or the selling of cannabis to be legalized? And if it's the selling of cannabis to be legalized, then in a sense, is it taking, not but it's the right money, but is it taking money from the people which are selling it, and then are they not going to move to sell another class? Because sometimes if you're selling it, you may think cannabis is class C, so let me sell that because of the risk benefit. If I get caught, then my prison time would be shorter than, say, if I'm selling heroin. So would it be better to then, say, legalize drugs rather than just cannabis? That was actually quite a lot of questions in one.
That's such a good question. We could talk for an hour about that. Okay, the straight answer is it's the legalization of regulated cannabis sales, which means that unregulated cannabis sales remain illegal. And I'll tell you an anecdote of when we didn't ask these thoughtful questions, which is in Colorado after legalization. So usually what we see is a huge drop in arrests, but the racial disparity stays the same or gets worse. What we saw in Colorado is for black and brown youth, there was no drop in arrests. The arrests actually went up because enforcement went up on people who were under 21 and now still had illegal possession. So we addressed that in later states by making sure that we decriminalized use for people who were under that age. And so I think I gave you the straight answer to your question, but I think you hit something really important, which is that you have to think of that ahead of time and you have to address it. For us, that means with the equity program that we say if you are an underground operator, we don't want you to be punished. We want you to come into the legal, compliant, regulated market, and we want to form that pathway for you. And of course, there's a lot of challenges in that, but that's the goal that we're working towards.
Go on, I'll give you one more question.
Okay, thank you. My voice is quiet. Okay. Hi, I just wanted to ask, because thank you for your talk on that, Shaleen. As you were speaking, what came up to me was, but we're not that confident here. I just feel like you guys are in America. Yes, of course, there's still the discrimination, racism, and so on. But here, this is my personal view, that I just believe that we allow too much things to happen
and then we argue after or quarrel after. We don't get in there before. I know what you're saying is that get the coalitions going, but even with that, demanding, we don't demand enough in this country. We keep making excuses, and as soon as the elitists say, you know, like when you said, oh, put that aside, you know, don't worry about that later, we then say, okay, we succumb too quick. And I just think, how do we become more braver and courageous when we're stepping into these, especially what you're suggesting here?
Yeah, I'd like to, I'll address it and then I'll open it to my colleagues who are clearly very confident and capable and know the local scene better. I think that it starts small. You said you were part of a local party, right? And there's 7 people there. So if someone brought another 7 people and they double it, imagine the power that you feel. That's how I started as well. I went to lobby somebody. It was super embarrassing. I brought a stack like this of medical marijuana studies, and I really thought that she was going to like legalize medical marijuana then and there. And she said, well, I read more than just what people hand me. And it hurt, you know, but I went back and I read up on it and I tried again. And then eventually you become that thought leader that they call, because there will be a time when they need to vote on the bill and they need somebody that they can trust to answer their questions. And you can be that person. And you know, you don't gain confidence overnight, but if all of you do that and all of you form a coalition, over time you will absolutely become more and more powerful. I promise.